Well, welcome everybody to this recorded session of a discussion that we're hosting with three Hudson Fellows, myself included. And of course, we're going to be talking about Sudan today. And for those of you who have not been following the news, conflict broke out there between or within the security services on April 15th. So we're now on day 6 here of the fighting, and the situation is steadily deteriorating. So we quickly pulled together this panel to discuss some of the issues that should be foremost in American policymakers' minds, and hopefully are, as they grapple with what is a very, very difficult situation. So we're going to be giving you a little bit of background on how we got here in Sudan, what were the proximate causes of the conflict. We'll move on to what American national security interests are in this conflict. It's half a world away, but it does dramatically affect American national interests. We'll look a bit at some of the complexities around possibly an evacuation attempt. We'll try to explicate the principles that policymakers should be bearing in mind as they try to think through and make a plan for evacuation in a very complex, very violent situation. So my name is Joshua Meservey. I am a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. I focus on African affairs, mostly great power competition, counterterrorism, and geopolitics. I'm joined by Robert Greenway. He is an adjunct fellow at Hudson Institute. He is the executive director of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. He has had a long government service, both in the military as Army Special Operations for years, then eventually on the National Security Council at a senior level, where he was heavily involved in American policy towards the Middle East and North Africa. So he knows both Sudan well, he knows the American policy scene well, and he understands a lot of the complications that come with trying to come up with an evacuation plan in as I said, a complex and violent setting. Then we'll go to James Barnett. He goes by Jake, so I'll call him Jake throughout this recording. Jake is a research fellow with Hudson. He is based in Lagos, Nigeria, where he is also a research fellow with the Center for Democracy and Development. He is a Fulbright scholar. He was also a Boren fellow in Tanzania. And so he, in addition to his West Africa work, he follows East Africa closely. And so we'll be able to give us his insights. So I'm going to dive right in here. We're going to try to keep this conversational, and we have a hard stop at 11 after 45 minutes. So like I said, I'll try to keep this quick. So Jake, let's start with you. Can you give us briefly, because we could talk for hours just on this one element, but briefly, what's going on here? Who are the major players? How did we get here? What's the background?
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh, for having me, and great to be on with you, Rob, as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that the groundwork for this for this conflict that we're seeing now was really has been laid over the preceding decades, and has really been escalating in recent years and recent months in a way that I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the conflict we're seeing now is that it was in many ways, it was quite predictable. People had been warning about this, something, along these lines, as in a clash between the security forces, since the kind of longtime strongman Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in 2019. In recent months, kind of particularly since February, there had again been escalating signs that, particularly these two blocks within the security sector, the Army, or the Sudan Armed Forces, and then the RSF, that's the Rapid Support Forces, kind of paramilitary militias, that they were increasingly at loggerheads. And I think to understand kind of briefly, right, and kind of recognition of our limited time, to understand some of the background to how we got here, it's important to look at the 30-year reign of Omar al-Bashir, who himself came to power in 1989 through a coup d'etat. He came, he rose up through the ranks of the military forces, became president when he was a colonel by overthrowing another military leader. And so Omar al-Bashir came to office, very much kind of aware of the risks of coups and fracturing within his own security sector and kind of the precarity of his own position as president. And part of the reason that you can, the reason for Bashir's longevity of a 30-year rule is that he played off political divisions within the security sector very well, including by kind of creating them artificially. And he also played a kind of on a separate point, he played some of the regional divisions within the Horn of Africa and the Middle East pretty savvily for about 30 years, although it eventually proved his downfall. But focusing on that first element, this kind of divisions within the security sector, essentially when the war started kicking off, the conflict in Darfur started kicking off in the late 90s, early 2000s, in which, of course, the Sudanese government was indicted by the ICC for crimes against humanity. They called it a counterinsurgency campaign, but it was an incredibly brutal, kind of campaign against the civilian population that many labeled genocide. So there were these militia forces in Darfur known as the Janjaweed, recruited primarily from what were called the Arab tribes. And so after several years of kind of this conflict brewing, Bashir realized that these kind of Janjaweed militias were almost a counterweight to his own army that he'd also been deploying in Darfur. And kind of aware of always the risk of a possible coup d'etat against his own regime from within the armed forces, he kind of took what were then some very disorganized state-backed militias and kind of created them into a more formal paramilitary structure called the Rapid Support Forces. And this one commander, I think it can be very accurately described as a warlord, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. He became the commander of these rapid support forces. And Bashir would even refer to this guy kind of jokingly as my protector, because the idea was that he was kind of taking this man who had very much been an outsider, who did not have the proper military education, who did not come from the core of the country, but from a kind of rural periphery. He was taking this outsider and boosting him and his men up to kind of a level that was increasingly equal with that of the military. And that, of course, caused some resentments. Then there was also the police, the intelligence services. And for several years, essentially, Bashir was playing these different forces against each other. In 2019, there were a series of popular protests against the Bashir regime, particularly with regards to rising bread prices, rising cost of living. There have been several protests in previous years, but the ones that started in December 2018, then went to April 2019, were very intense. And so eventually the security agencies, even though there were kind of all these rivalries among them, they decided to team up and overthrow Bashir because they saw that his own tenure wasn't going to last very long. And so that takes us into this kind of 4-year period of what can be called kind of generally the transition within Sudan, although at many points the transition has been effectively stalled, unfortunately. And essentially the security agencies who had teamed up to overthrow Bashir, there was a lot of international pressure on them to hand over power to a civilian government. There was a massacre very early on in the transition that I think showed a lot of analysts and observers that many of these military forces, both the Sudan Armed Forces, but also the RSF, were not interested in handing over power to a civilian government. And kind of to speed up and, rather than going through the full kind of 4-year transition period, the RSF and the military kind of alternated between being, rivals and allies. They were allies insofar as when push came to shove, they would team up together to try to keep civilians out of government. And they did this in late 2021 when they launched a coup against the the interim civilian technocratic-led government. So they teamed up for that. And, because they had this common interest, which is that they didn't want the power of the security sector to be threatened by civilian governance. But at the same time, both of these sides were increasingly suspicious of each other. I mean, Hemedti proved to be a very savvy political player. He kind of played the transition very well, positioning himself as an outsider and therefore an opponent not only of the former Bashir regime, but also to some extent of the military, with a lot of Sudanese getting frustrated with the kind of the coup and the military governance that was happening. And it helped that the head of the Sudan Armed Forces was the nominal head of the Sudanese interim government, and Hemedti was number 2. So you had this weird dynamic where Hemedti, even though he was very much part of the problem, was also positioning himself as kind of an alternative power center to the military, one with, if you will, kind of a bit more of a populist base. But the military, meanwhile, was very concerned about the growing influence of the RSF, the growing influence of Hemedti. The RSF had become very rich over the years, both because of their work in Darfur. They'd been kind of the preferred, Bashir's preferred enforcers in that region. And so they'd gotten access to lucrative gold mining there that they were able to smuggle out of the country. They also served as mercenaries in Yemen, to some extent in Libya. So they were kind of tapping into all these transnational kind of security and illicit smuggling networks and stuff, becoming very rich, buying up a very big arsenal, to the point that they were really threatening the Sudan armed forces. And so to kind of quickly wrap up, essentially within the past few months, you've had the international community pushing the, what they would call the military or the security sector to try to hand over to a civilian government, and to try to kind of reignite that process of the political transition. But the problem is that the military or the security sector is not a unified bloc. You can't just look at it as, the guys with the guns versus the civilians. And so one of the big outstanding questions was, what's the future going to be of these two essentially parallel armies, the formal Sudan armed forces and then the RSF? And also keep in mind that there are a lot of kind of cultural differences. The Sudan armed forces, the officer class particularly, is recruited more from kind of the Nile regions, the center of the country. They have formal military training. They have this kind of proud tradition that they see themselves as being a formal kind of military officer class, whereas the RSF are seen as, these camel herders from the Western hinterlands. They don't have proper military training. They're just these kind of ruthless, SOBs who have kind of gotten lucky and played their cards right. And so they shouldn't even be our equals. That's kind of the thinking among a lot of these generals. And so essentially within the past few months, starting really in February, as I began my little spiel with, there was a lot of tension kind of brewing, where it was very clear that the RSF was kind of starting to move in forces closer to Khartoum, that the Sudan armed forces were going on higher alert. And that part of it was because of this debate that was kind of being brokered by the international community of what is the future of the RSF. The Sudan armed forces wanted them to integrate into the military very quickly within a 2-year span. Hemedti saw that and knew that this would essentially mean that all of his wealth, all of his power, his men would be subordinate to the military, and that maybe his own personal fortune then and his own personal future was then at risk, because he could easily be, if he doesn't have his army, he can easily be arrested for any number of the crimes he's committed. And so the tension started brewing, and it kind of became this very serious standoff. And then eventually, it was just Saturday, and it's crazy how quickly it's escalated in just 6 days. But it was just on Saturday that the first shots were finally fired in Khartoum. And again, this is something that Sudanese people on the ground have been reporting this for several months. More checkpoints. We know who the RSF checkpoints are. We see these guys from Darfur being brought in. We know that the military is also stocking up on their weapons. So it was all kind of very predictable. And I think there's a lot more to say about this, but I'm very curious to hear my colleague Rob's assessment. So turn it over to him.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jake. That was a great background. I think you hit the major points there. And these, as you pointed out, these intra-security services tensions have been brewing for a long time. There was even reports of armed clashes way back in the Darfur days between the SAF and RSF, even though SAF was getting up to its own sort of genocidal activities. There was still tensions between the RSF and SAF way back, 2 decades ago. And then even you mentioned the Khartoum massacre of protesters. There were reports that RSF, barricaded some SAF officers in barracks when they were getting ready to launch this massacre. So yeah, these tensions have been brewing. And now they've boiled over. So let's bring in Rob here. Rob, can you lay out for us, let's start with American national interests in Sudan, okay? It's half a world away, but why does this let's start with, why does this matter to Americans?
Thanks, appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. Appreciate Jake's overview and summary of how we got here, and it's hard to improve on it. I think it's always right to start with what U.S. vital interests are. I identify 3 interests that, in my estimation, are vital to the U.S., and then 3 contributing factors which are equally, in some ways, important. The first is safeguarding strategic lines of communication. The Red Sea, of which Sudan has a significant coastline, constitutes 12% of global trade and $1 trillion annually. There are also 15 undersea cables that follow the same pattern. It's 25% of the world's internet traffic. The last thing I think we want to do is see a disruption of that, because the global economy is so dependent upon it, and our adversaries and competitors equally would like to obtain influence over it. So I think Sudan matters strategically to the United States in that sense. Second, I would say we have a combating terrorism objective. Previously, under Bashir, the country was listed on and deservedly listed as a state sponsor of terrorism that famously provided refuge to Osama bin Laden and many other terrorist groups. And I think migrating it was a significant achievement. And it was on that trajectory where we removed them from the state sponsor of terror list in the previous administration and incorporated them within the Abraham Accords framework and normalized diplomatic relations with Israel, reversing the three famous no's from 1967 in Khartoum and the Arab League. So combating terrorism and preventing Sudan from once again becoming a sanctuary, a safe haven for global terrorists is also equally vital to the United States. I would say the third would be preventing a humanitarian crisis, which Sudan unfortunately is all too close to before the escalation in hostilities. And that I think is reversible, but certainly preventable. And that would be the third U.S. interest in my judgment. The three contributing factors I would say is influence. After the debacle in Kabul, after what happened in Benghazi a few years ago, and we just celebrated the 40th anniversary of our withdrawal after the terrorist bombing of the U.S. Embassy barracks in Beirut, the U.S. can ill afford to lose the credibility and evacuate another U.S. diplomatic facility because of a conflict. Second, I would say, again, the fact that Sudan was on a trajectory to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel, become integrated into the global community of nations. I think that was an important trajectory. It's vital to get back to it. If a U.S.-led effort to do that fails and stumbles, I think we lose a tremendous amount of credibility, and that would be poorly timed. The last contributing factor is that China and Russia want to expand their influence in the region and are certainly eager to fill the void. China has a port already in Djibouti to the south, but Port Sudan would be a huge feather in their cap and a great addition to the Belt and Road Initiative, and it would extend Chinese predatory practices and malign influence. Likewise, Russia has long sought access to Port Sudan and continues, I think, to exploit it and its Wagner presence, which in many ways the RSF relationship with, I think, is something we all watch very carefully. So in my judgment, those are the three vital interests and the three contributing factors why the United States is and should be interested in what happens in Sudan.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That was great. Yeah, I'm struck. The sensitive region that Sudan is in, that alone makes this, should make it front of mind for American policymakers. It's right across the Red Sea from Saudi Arabia, of course. It has 500 some odd miles of coastline, as you mentioned, on the Red Sea. And then this history of terrorism, you mentioned Osama bin Laden, but Sudan was also a strong friend of Iran for many years, and under Bashir. And Iran smuggled weapons through Sudan. They built an ammo factory. So this has been a problem country for the United States for decades. And then there was this moment of hope in 2019 when the popular uprising toppled Bashir, and then also forced the coup leaders to make some concessions to civilians and bring them into the government. Now we've seen how that's gone. Those hopes seem dead and buried for now, which is part of the tragedy here. Sudan, as you mentioned, had a real chance to enter the community of nations and solidify its economy and everything else. But now we're rapidly headed towards a civil war, I think. So Rob, lay out for us, we want to talk about American citizens in Sudan. There's lots of issues here, but right now the US government needs to be focused on how do you protect Americans in Sudan. There may be as many as 16,000. I just heard that estimate in the country. That's a lot of Americans. A lot of them are probably dual nationals. What is the current situation militarily, right? That makes American citizens that puts them at risk, and also makes it very difficult to plan and execute an evacuation.
Sure. And so since Saturday, when the fighting became, I think, most acute and the situation deteriorated in Khartoum as well as peripheral regions, most of the fighting has since been around the Army headquarters. And I think the RSF intent was to perform a sort of surgical operation to decapitate Burhan and the Sudanese armed forces by going after the headquarters. It didn't succeed, but the headquarters is strategically located next to the international airport. And if you want to introduce aid and assistance and evacuate personnel, the airport is the easiest way to do it because Khartoum lies in the middle of the country. And so that complicates our ability and our flexibility and those of other nations. Secondly, I would say that while the RSF is distributed, they're disorganized, command and control is infamously or notoriously absent. The Sudanese armed forces maintain largely control over the entries in and out of the city itself. And for security purposes, it makes it difficult to move in any way, shape, or form. So civilians have been told to shelter in place. And as you said, there could be as many as 16,000 Americans distributed across Sudan, most likely in Khartoum. But the reality is no one knows. And the last thing I think we can ill afford is not to have accountability of our people, because you'll never know who's left behind. And we just experienced this, unfortunately, in Afghanistan. And I don't think we're keen to repeat that. Lastly, I would say that the security situation continues to devolve. The infrastructure has always been fragile in Sudan for 1,000 reasons, mostly inherited by 40 years of neglect under Bashir. And so it has always been fragile. And without critical supplies, particularly fuel, the electricity and the telecommunications infrastructure and water, which is in spotty supply in most of Sudan and certainly in Khartoum, could stop. And so those sheltering in place are about to run out of supplies. We just entered into Eid al-Fitr, the end of the Ramadan period, where a ceasefire yet again broke down and was in many ways to provide a window of opportunity, perhaps to get accountability and to consolidate isolated personnel, including Americans, but it has proved not to be the case. And again, because this was predictable, we should have, I think, taken better precautions earlier. But now we are at a point in which we can't introduce critical supplies. We can't organize an evacuation. No one is in charge of the entirety of the security situation. And individuals are not going to be able to shelter in place because they won't have critical supplies in which to do it. And they're certainly unsecure. Accordingly, there have been failed attempts by other nations to evacuate their personnel. But again, for reasons already cited, they've been unable to do it. We should make common cause, I think, to reverse that situation. There has been diplomatic convoys. The US convoy was actually under small arms fire. The EU aid agency chief was shot, but seems to be recovering. Aid workers have been physically assaulted and raped. And the World Food Program, one of the most viable organizations in Sudan, has lost 3 of their staff members just since fighting began this weekend. And the situation continues to deteriorate. There are now, accordingly, some 331 casualties according to Sudan's statistics. The numbers are probably higher, and over 3,000 wounded. The 9 hospitals in Khartoum have been hit by artillery. 16 have been evacuated, and so none are functional insofar as we know. And so the situation is dire, and we have probably 24 to 48 hours before the situation becomes even more precarious. And so in my judgment, we need to first get accountability for our personnel and safeguard them so that we can begin the process of coordinating an evacuation. We need to establish security at evacuation points and along critical infrastructure, including the routes from major consolidation points to points of evacuation. And that is going to require the introduction of forces almost certainly. And those forces should be staged in close proximity now so that we can preserve our options and our decision space. And I don't know that that's taken place. And it's important to recognize that both from a defense standpoint, Sudan sits in AFRICOM nominally, but is closer to the Central Command area responsibility. And so it's sort of at the dividing line between areas of responsibility. And assets now are at probably the lowest they've been in many decades. So we have less flexibility than we're used to. And second, I think we can establish command and control now between state, aid, defense, intel community, and international service providers to prepare and stage resources for international humanitarian assistance. As we already knew, the situation is precarious. Now is the time to assemble the resources so that we can introduce them to alleviate the suffering that has already begun. And the situation wasn't good to begin with. And lastly, I think because the situation was foreseeable, it could have been anticipated. In many ways, it was accelerated by the political framework agreement. I think we need to look to new leadership to get us out of this predicament. And I think that is warranted under the circumstances. And then also, I think leveraging our international partners, particularly Egypt, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others in Europe and Asia, I think also can make common cause in order to undertake a concerted effort to evacuate our personnel, to arbitrate the conflict to the best extent that we can, which would include a ceasefire to do that, and then the provision of humanitarian resources, which needs to happen.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. The challenges are daunting here. One more quick question for you, and then I want to bring in Jake on some of the regional dynamics that are affecting all of this. Realistically, in your assessment, how quickly can the U.S. get a plan together and an operation underway to evacuate? Now, I know some of this is unknown, right? We don't know how much planning has been done so far, and et cetera, but this is I keep coming back to this. This is a hugely complex and difficult operation, which will take a lot of planning. How quickly, I mean, are we talking about something that we're not realistically going to be able to see for another week? Or is it something that, okay, maybe in the next couple of days, we might see something? What's your assessment on this?
Well, it's a great question, and it's vital. First, I'd say that plans are required, right? So base plans are required for all of our diplomatic facilities and our presence overseas. So there is a plan to evacuate personnel in crisis that it can be adapted to the environment. Normally, those plans are predicated on having a point in which you can exfiltrate or evacuate non-essential or essential personnel in varying security environments. As I said earlier, one of the most critical resources here is the international airport, which is now one of the areas of the most intense fighting, is likely to remain so. And I believe the Sudanese Armed Forces goal is to clear out the RSF in and around the airport as soon as practical. And that would help us, I think, establish security at the airfield so that we can begin the evacuation process. So I think we have a plan in place in terms of the assets and resources required to do it. If our partners on the ground in Sudan, if the government and the Sudanese Armed Forces don't obtain a point in which they can provide security for the point of evacuation and the routes to them, then we're going to have to introduce those forces. The disposition of U.S. forces and the ability to respond comes in a couple of flavors. We can introduce forces very, very quickly in hours or days, but substantial reinforcements will take upwards of potentially a week to get there, depending on where some of our offshore and afloat assets reside. So hopefully those are en route now. And those two will be able to ensure that we can put a plan together, but both of which require on-the-ground security. But as I said, there's a balance now between those that are sheltering in place for the moment, secure but running out of supplies and unprotected, and the situation on the ground, which is going to have to be coordinated with local armed groups, either militias or the Sudanese Armed Forces. So we're going to probably have to introduce U.S. forces in order to execute this if the situation continues to deteriorate, and I suspect it will.
Yeah, and one of the scary elements of this scenario, and you referenced this earlier in your comments, is what is the command and control situation? Even if the senior leadership of these armed forces send orders down the chain of command, will anybody listen to them? Or do they have the capacity to disseminate these orders widely enough for people to know what they're supposed to do? I think this is perhaps a particular concern with the RSF, because this is essentially a militia. It's a glorified militia. And there's already been reports of them rampaging through various areas, looting, assaulting civilians, behaving in a way that you would hope a professional military would not. So yeah, this yet another complication here that you'd already referenced. Okay, Jake, let's talk about some of the regional players here, because again, Rob has already talked about a few of them. He's referenced a couple countries. You did, I think probably I did. So that demonstrates how important the region is here to what's going on. So who, what are the prospects for the region to play a constructive role here? Who has influence with the various forces? Who might the U.S. be talking with to try to bring about a humanitarian ceasefire, to facilitate an evacuation, and then even beyond that, something longer term?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I mean, as you know, the regional dimensions here are very important. They played a role, to some extent in the toppling of Omar al-Bashir in 2019. There are reports that the coup plotters, both Burhan, the head of the Sudanese intelligence, and even, Hemedti, that they were in contact with officials in Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Cairo, kind of in the lead up to the coup. And so I think that those three countries, right, Saudi, UAE, and Egypt, have historically played a pretty significant role in Sudan in kind of the later years of the Bashir era. I mean, Egypt, obviously, going back millennia. But then, since 2019, those three countries have definitely kind of worked very hard to maintain their influence in the country. And I think that what we've seen is a bit of a bifurcation in recent years, with the kind of Egypt really putting its weight behind the Sudan armed forces. General al-Burhan, the titular leader of Sudan and the Sudanese armed forces, trained in Egypt. He also trained in Jordan, so he has very good connections with some of those kind of older Arab militaries, whereas the UAE has some, very close ties with Hemedti. Hemedti has personal wealth in the UAE. He worked, or he sent his men over to fight in Yemen under Emirati control. There have been a lot of interesting reports about some of the gold smuggling out of Darfur, kind of going through Dubai, which is a big clearinghouse for illicit gold. So that's, when the war broke out on Saturday, I mean, already it was kind of, the worst case scenario. There was serious heavy fighting in Khartoum, right? You had jets, fighter planes kind of strafing buildings in the capital city, which is something that, for all of the violence that Sudan has experienced in its recent history, Khartoum had not experienced like intense urban warfare like that. So already this was a very serious issue. And, I think the immediate reaction of a lot of analysts and observers, beyond of course, the horror of what was already happening, is this fear of like, this could spread so quickly. And already by the end of the first day, we were seeing some indications of that, where there have been Egyptian forces, particularly some Air Force units at certain airfields in Sudan that are there as part of this arrangement between the transitional military government and Cairo. And the RSF actually, and I think we now know with some of the recent reporting, they had intentionally been sending their forces out there in the days leading up to the combat to actually surround some of those airfields, because they really wanted, they realized that one of the SAF's advantage was the air power of Egyptian jets, Egyptian pilots. And so they came in to try to neutralize that early on, as well as attacking the general command, as Rob noted. So already from day one, there are signs that the Egyptians are involved in this. Since then, there have been reports that the Egyptians have, in fact, and thankfully, the situation with those prisoners, the Egyptians who were captured, it seems to have, not sparked the major kind of casus belli that it might have been. I think the RSF was careful not to, publicly harm any of these soldiers or whatever. But, subsequent reports have shown that the Egyptians are providing air support and logistical support to the SAF. And on the same side, for with Hemedti, the Sudanese armed forces have kind of very coyly accused, two countries, one of which to the west of Sudan is supporting the RSF. We know that the forces to the west, it's Khalifa Haftar, the Libyan warlord, who again has historically been backed, by the Emiratis and also by the Russians. And there's now been a report that he's sent over one, plane of supplies to support the RSF. So already you have Egypt and a powerful Libyan leader kind of involved in it. To Sudan's west, you have the Chadian government, which is actually, despite some of Hemedti's connections to Chad, so far they've actually kind of sided more with the SAF. They've stopped, they arrested or detained a number of RSF forces on the border. I think moving forward, if there is a bit of a glimmer of hope, I think that it would be to some extent in, the kind of lopsided backing kind of the lopsidedness of which international powers are backing whom within Sudan. And I think that, for all the talk of Hemedti's connections with the UAE, I think one thing, we can say about the Emiratis in Africa, and there's a lot to, this kind of goes both ways, both as a criticism, but also potentially, an avenue for some progress here, is that the Emiratis are quite practical. And I think what they saw with their experience in Libya backing Haftar was that, it's backing kind of an upstart warlord can be a risky endeavor. And so I think that what we see now is that Hemedti doesn't, he lacks some of the serious capacity and capabilities that the SAF has. He doesn't have air power. They've managed to shoot down a few SAF helicopters. That's what kind of the open source shows, but he doesn't have his own air force. There have been reports that he's even running out of ammunition, which is one of the reasons that he was getting resupplied from Libya. So, with the Eid holiday coming up, there's maybe some hope that kind of the international powers here can play a role to try to mediate. And that would be both, kind of the constructive, proactive, positive role of the powers, whether it's Saudi, whether it's, the US and European countries kind of coming together and saying, look, you guys need to hash out an arrangement. But also it can come of the form of, someone like Hemeti not receiving the support that he might want and expect to have, from a country like the UAE. So I think that, the more the conflict has already been internationalized to some extent, but I think that the hope would be that, especially if kind of the less proximate countries, if we talk about Saudi, UAE, US, Europe, all that stuff, if they can kind of play a kind of a tempering role on the ambitions of the two generals, and I think Hemeti in particular, that might be an avenue for some progress. I think one thing I just want to add, because Josh, your comment kind of brought this to mind, is that I think that, absolutely, and from the perspective of US interests, our objective right now is focusing on Khartoum, because that's where most of the internationals are. That's where really the center of this fighting. I think that it's important, though, too, not to lose sight of kind of the long-term ramifications, or even the very near-term ramifications that this conflict is having in the more peripheral regions. We've seen a lot of fighting in the east already, and I think that there's a lot of reason to be worried about what will happen in Darfur. I think that, you're absolutely correct what you said about the RSF having very poor command and control. And I think that generally, within Khartoum and that kind of area, the SAF does have a much stronger kind of command and control over its forces than the RSF does. But one of the worrying signs we've seen is that the SAF has actually gone on kind of a very rapid recruitment drive in Darfur in recent days to try to undercut Hemeti's kind of tribal base. He's recruiting from some of those same tribes that the RSF pulls from. And I think recruiting, in some instances, it sounds like it's really conscription. And so I think that, it's those fighters are not going to be ones that go through a typical 6-month basic training course, right? These are essentially the military arming militias to fight the militias that are already there. So I think that while our immediate focus absolutely should be on kind of all those points that Rob addressed, and just getting the fighting to kind of come down to into a bit of a lull, particularly within Khartoum. We also need to already start thinking about kind of what are going to be the long-term ramifications for the more peripheral regions of Sudan that have unfortunately been experiencing conflict for many, many years.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one of the frustrations that is always the case in these types of situations is that our information is really limited, particularly. So we actually have decent information, not good, but okay information from Khartoum, because we have things like Twitter, and people still have access to their mobile phones and stuff. So there are some reports getting out of Khartoum, but there's almost nothing getting out of places like Darfur and the east that you mentioned, and all over. So we have a real blind spot everywhere, including in Khartoum, but especially, I would say, in these peripheral areas. And one of the nightmare scenarios is a true balkanization of Sudan. I think that's this is a longer term conversation, and because we are focused on the immediate fighting right now, but I think that is a real possibility, right? That these regions that have always had uncomfortable at best relations with each other and within the body politic of Sudan, this may be what finally carves them off. Who knows, right? But I think that is one of the scenarios we have to think about. And very quickly, and then I want to bring Rob back in. So you mentioned Chad, which I think you're absolutely correct. Chad is worried about this borderland because they've had rebel groups that have arisen out of there and challenged in N'Djamena. So that's always a concern. And Hemeti is actually from some of those tribes that have posed a challenge to the Chadian regime. But you also have another major country here, Ethiopia, right, which is watching with great interest, I'm sure, what's going on in Sudan. So very quickly, talk about Ethiopia for us and its relations with Sudan.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And that's a great point. Obviously, you can't really talk about this with talking about Ethiopia. I think that, one of the big contexts here is that there's this border dispute between Ethiopia and Sudan that kind of really flared up and turned into some actual fighting during the kind of Ethiopian civil war that broke out in November 2020. There have also been this larger kind of geopolitical issue over Ethiopia's construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which has turned into a real flashpoint between Ethiopia and Cairo, but also kind of Sudan in recent years, especially kind of shifting kind of more into the Egyptian sphere in terms of having, their opposition to the dam. I think that Ethiopia is actually a much trickier question to kind of to assess their position. And I think that Abiy, himself has been relatively cautious here. I think that part of that is because the Ethiopian government is actually quite hard to read at this moment because there are a lot of competing interests there. And so, for example, I think that the position of, say, some of the powerful kind of Amharan politicians in the northern part of Ethiopia that share some of the border with Sudan are maybe kind of, there have been reports or speculation that some of them, might be interested in kind of supporting the RSF as a way to kind of undercut Sudan over some of these border disputes and kind of expand their own territory as like a state within Ethiopia, as kind of a federated state within Ethiopia. But I think there are also kind of a lot of, either competing or moderating influences within Ethiopia. The government, Ethiopia as a state's just in a very precarious moment right now. There's a lot of kind of this question over the reintegration of the Tigray region into the country after what was, a brutal, kind of horrendous, almost 2-year war. So for now, I think that, from what we've seen, I think that Ethiopia is kind of, to the extent that we can talk about a coherent or cohesive foreign policy, they've been very focused on trying to prevent spillover, and, to try to play a mediating role. This is also something that Abiy, the prime minister, has kind of always had this ambition to be the regional peacemaker. And this was an ambition that was kind of, I think, very encouraged by, Western powers for several years. And then when the war broke out, there was a bit of kind of chagrin that maybe, Abiy had been so kind of lauded and stuff for this kind of regional peacemaking when he didn't have his own house in order. But I think that Abiy is kind of also eager to kind of prove, as maybe a sign that Ethiopia has moved on from this devastating internal war that is now ready to kind of assume more of a regional position. And so, they've released some statements on this already. I would not be surprised if Abiy tries to kind of play a very public mediating role between these two factions. But yeah, I think, I would maybe end on a caveat, which for now is that actually Ethiopian foreign policy is maybe a bit trickier to read on this than, some of these other countries, just because of the internal divisions that I think are still not kind of fully clear, even within Addis Ababa and within the country at large.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it was the Sudanese armed forces that were primarily involved in the border conflict with Ethiopia. So that's an interesting wrinkle here. But what that means in practical terms, I think we sort of have to wait and see as far as what Ethiopia will do. So Rob, let's finish up with you here. We've got 5 minutes. What should we be looking for from the U.S. government right now, as far as indications, right, that it's moving in the right direction on evacuation with the seriousness and urgency that I think we all agree is required here? And again, what are sort of the broad principles that someone sitting in the Situation Room right now, or at the NSC or at State or whatever, who is working on this should bear in mind? Again, this is a uniquely Sudanese situation, but there are broader principles, I think, that everyone should have front of mind as they work on this.
Sure, and let's state up front that there's a dynamic tension between now, which is managing a crisis which has already occurred, and sort of preventing the negative attention associated with it. And that's a hard thing to do because there's inevitably a requirement to manage both. But the reality is that we have U.S. persons unaccounted for and at risk. And that's got to be addressed, and it's got to be addressed acutely. And it means you need to introduce the resources into the area to preserve the full range of options. And hopefully that is underway. And I think that is immediate. The second is there is, in fact, an opportunity to work to restore this to a positive trajectory. Look, two armies were never going to share Sudan. It was always going to be a managed transition. And as Jake stated earlier, was it going to be 2 years of assimilation or 10 years? The reality is we already picked a side. And I can see convergent interests, I think, with helping the Sudanese armed forces get to a situation to manage the security and get back on track to managing the transition to incorporating civilian rule in the government as a whole. And this is the opportunity to do it. And I think we need to work with our partners to reduce the foreign influence before it gets worse. What we don't want is a devolution that we saw in Libya and frankly in Yemen and other regional areas that I think serve no one's interest. So I think we need to prevent the external influence and the resources that are going to fuel conflict and instability and the balkanization that you rightly warned against at the outset. But it requires U.S. leadership, which means you have to elevate this beyond the level that was previously managing the portfolio, and that at this point led to a crisis, unfortunately. And that means that we're going to have to put more capital at stake in addition to resources. But that would allow us to bring in our partners and allies that have different but consistent goals and objectives, which frankly got us to the point where we managed to transition from Bashir to something else. And so now we're faced with a similar opportunity during this crisis to put Sudan back on track. But we're going to have to elevate it. We're going to have to introduce additional resources, and we're going to have to work more closely with partners in the region. If we don't, everyone's going to make their own decisions based on what they think is best for them. And unfortunately, that seldom works out to anyone's advantage. Not the United States, not the individual countries, certainly not the long-suffering people of Sudan.
Yeah, well said. So we're right at time here, so I think we'll wrap it up. There's obviously, I mean, we could have talked for hours. This is such an interesting problem set, but we also, I'm glad you made your final comment there about the people of Sudan, Rob, because fundamentally this is a tragedy for the Sudanese. Hundreds dead already. It's almost certainly more. We have no idea where this is going. The trauma that people have already suffered. And it's all because, frankly, the selfishness of two men who have decided to fight this out, and no matter the consequences for the Sudanese people. So it's bigger than these two men. Obviously, there's deep fundamental structural issues within Sudan that have led to some of this as well. But but for now, I think the U.S. needs to be laser focused on what do we do to help American citizens who are in danger, and then, as you say, already be laying the groundwork for some sort of resolution to this, where there can be stability and security in that country, as daunting of a challenge as that is. So thank you both for your time. I thought this was really, really interesting and productive. Maybe we'll have to do a reprise of this in a few days. It's such a dynamic situation that I'm sure there'll be developments shortly that might require some further commentary. So without further ado, we're right at time. So thank you both.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jake.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.